But I think that Horner, with that letter, signed his own death warrant.
Miriam, Horner wrote an interesting letter this week to his fellow PC MLAs. What did it say?
So this is a letter that was leaked over the weekend, and in it he's basically defending his record following the AG report. And you'll remember we obviously talked about this last week, his sort of refusal to take responsibility for the abuse of the planes. And so, of course, there were opposition calls for his resignation, and the Wild Rose went out and put out, five reasons Doug Horner must resign. And so this email seemed to be really motivated by that, because he sort of picked those 5 reasons and responded to them, but basically said again that it's not his responsibility, that he was following the policy as it's written now, and that he's not going to be resigning even if there are calls for his resignation coming from inside the Tory caucus, which this letter seemed to indicate. And what I actually thought was really interesting too about this was that it didn't include his Rick McIver or Thomas Lukaszuk on the distribution list. They never received this email. And also I thought it was interesting that Doug Horner signs off by saying that he's going to continue to work to get Prentice elected as the new leader of the PC party and Premier of Alberta. So but really it seemed to me to be motivated by all of the sort of questions that have been raised and swirling around him and his involvement in this scandal.
Yeah, well, clearly he's feeling some pressure right now. But Paula and Sheila, I want to sort of get a sense of how this might play out for the next PC leader, whoever it is, because I got to think Doug Horner, he's not a guy that you just easily dismiss, do you? So what do you do with a guy like Doug Horner?
Well, I think in some ways Doug Horner has made it very easy for whomever comes next, because if he hadn't written this letter, then I think you're right. I mean, he's the Northern power broker. He's a guy who was a credible candidate for the leadership last time around, was doing some serious tire kicking to run for the leadership this time around. But that letter, which was garbled, quasi-illiterate, and made him look weak and whiny in some ways, gives whoever becomes the leader, and I think for the purpose of argument, we'll assume that's likely to be Jim Prentice, a much easier way to ease Doug Horner out the door, because, I mean, Horner has now made himself dead man walking. And Miriam's right. I mean, I initially in my own column referred to this as a letter to the Tory caucus. It isn't. It's a letter to the Jim Prentice supporters in the Tory caucus, which, oh, wait for it, is everybody except Rick McIver and Thomas Lukaszuk. But nonetheless, I mean, what I hadn't really thought about when I wrote my column earlier this week is to what extent that letter is really an attempt to suck up and curry favor with Jim Prentice, because it ends with the big Jim Prentice rah-rah, if I can do it, you can do it. But I think that Horner, with that letter, signed his own death warrant.
Well, it's interesting that Paula makes some really good points there. I can also see, for a man of his stature, his background in the party, he's been a very heavyweight, he's a real establishment figure. His father, as we all know, was a big man in politics. It must really sting to see him brought down by foibles of a premier that everyone disliked. He tried to play a above-it-all role, and in terms of sheer ministerial responsibility, that fell apart when the Auditor General says, you're the guy responsible. I mean, in theory then, for ministerial responsibility, you could expect him to resign, possibly. Not that anyone ever does that here. And I just think it must have really stung him personally to have his career end like this. So I think this is a bit of him lashing back and saying, I'm protecting myself. I'm not going down easily. You guys can try it, but it's not happening this way. I'm a better man than that. It's very true that if Jim Prentice wants to take him down, he is reaching into the Tory party. It's going to be a little more problematic than his promise to get rid of Jeff Johnson, who we assume won't be in cabinet. Even his, I'm not even sure about people like Doug Griffiths. These are not the heavyweights that Doug Horner is. Right. So if you let him go, there could be a little bit of cost, but there's probably more to be gained by letting him go.
And it is a shame, because Horner, I mean, for all of the backlash that he's faced in the last 2 weeks, Horner always had a reputation as a decent guy and a straight shooter. I mean, it's impossible to imagine him, swanning around with an advanced team checking out the caviar for him before he arrived someplace. I mean, he's a very down-to-earth, straight arrow guy.
If other cabinet ministers had his ethics about flying, we probably wouldn't be in a huge problem.
But the problem is that it was his job to make sure that the planes were not being misused, as he himself acknowledges in the letter. And what the letter effectively says is that he was running the planes on an honor system. And I don't think the letter makes him look corrupt. I think the letter makes him look incompetent or afraid to stand up to Alison Redford when she was premier. Neither of those is a very good narrative to have. But Sheila's right. I mean, he was a very respected politician, and that's why that letter is so remarkable. And the fact that the people who were with him on Team Prentice, that somebody leaked that letter to the media. I mean, wow. Maybe stuff like this was going on for years with backbiting and rivalries within caucus, but they never let it leak out like this. The fact that they're going to the media, someone in that caucus betrayed him and shopped him with that letter, with the leak. And that's an interesting symptom of what's wrong with the party right now, too.